Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Pearl Adebayo and Robert Cole grew up on the same dusty street where children chased old tires and women called across balconies at sunset. Robert was the restless boy with huge dreams and too much silence behind his smile. Pearl was the gentle girl who noticed everything, including the fear he hid whenever people praised his future. They were never officially together, yet everyone saw how naturally they belonged near each other. When Robert talked about leaving Nigeria someday, Pearl laughed with him, but her heart always tightened after the laughter ended each evening. When Robert finally got a chance to travel, the neighborhood celebrated as though one of their own had already become great. Neighbors shook his hand, old women prayed over him, and boys followed him like he carried tomorrow inside his pocket. Pearl stood slightly apart, smiling too carefully. Later, under the fading evening light, Robert found her by the gate and said, "I'll come back for a real life, Pearl. I promise." Pearl searched his face and whispered, "Don't become a stranger." He touched her hand once, briefly, and said, "Never." Both believed that promise completely. Years later, just before Robert's final departure, fate brought him and Pearl together again. She was no longer the soft teenager he had left behind, and he was no longer the careless dreamer who spoke big and planned little. They met by accident near a pharmacy, stayed too long, then laughed at how quickly old familiarity returned. One meeting turned into another, then another. Within days, they were walking roads they had once walked as children, but everything between them had changed. The tenderness was older now, deeper and heavy, with all the years they had missed. That brief week became the kind of memory both would later survive on. Robert admitted how terrified he was of failing abroad. Pearl confessed she was tired of watching life happen to other people while she remained standing in the same corner. One rainy evening, sitting under a small zinc shelter, Robert said softly, "If I make it there, I'll come back differently. Better." Pearl answered, "Just come back the same way it matters." What passed between them after that felt bigger than comfort and deeper than desire. They gave themselves to a future they believed still had room for them. Robert left with hope, pressure, and a hunger he could not explain to anyone who had never been poor. The early months abroad broke him in quiet ways. His phone was stolen. He lost contact numbers. He slept in cramped spaces, worked humiliating jobs, and learned how quickly dignity could disappear when survival became urgent. He wanted to call Pearl, but one week became another, then another. Each delay made the next message harder to send. Shame sat beside him like another shadow. He told himself he would reach out properly once his life looked worthy of being described. Back home, Pearl waited with more patience than pride. At first, a few messages came, then they slowed, then stopped. Every time her phone vibrated, her chest tightened before common sense reminded her not to hope too quickly. She defended him when others mocked men who left and forgot. "He must be struggling," she would say quietly. But silence has a way of sounding like rejection, even when it begins as hardship. Months became years, and though Pearl never stopped caring for Robert, she slowly understood that love can weaken under distance, even when betrayal never formally arrives at all. Just as Pearl was learning how to carry disappointment without collapsing under it, a new truth arrived and changed the shape of her life. She was pregnant. The result left her sitting still for a long time, hand trembling, eyes fixed on nothing. She was not ashamed of the child itself, but she knew exactly how the neighborhood would speak. They remembered everything. They forgave little. Pearl pressed her palm against her stomach and whispered Robert's name like a question she was too frightened to answer. For the first time, silence was no longer only emotional. It had become dangerous too. She tried to think practically. She even started writing Robert a letter she did not know where to send. But before she could decide anything, another disaster swept in. Her mother, Aline, collapsed and was admitted to the hospital. From that moment, Pearl's fear had to stand aside for duty. She spent long days moving between nurses, drug shops, lab desks, and prayer corners, carrying unpaid bills and private panic at once. Every time she tried to think about the baby, her mother's coffin dragged her back to urgency. Life did not allow her one crisis at a time. It piled them together. Aline's illness worsened quickly, leaving Pearl exhausted and hollow-eyed before her pregnancy had even begun to show properly. She slept on hospital benches, skipped meals, borrowed money, and smiled weakly whenever her mother asked if everything was fine. But mothers often hear what daughters hide. One night, while the word hummed softly and machines blinked in tired rhythm, Aline looked at Pearl's face too long and said, "You're carrying more than fear, my child." Pearl froze. Tears rose before words did. She finally nodded, and the truth settled heavily between them like a fresh wound. Pearl expected anger, but Aline only sighed with painful tenderness. Her voice was weak, yet each word carried weight. "Don't chase a struggling man with news that may drown him before he stands," she whispered. "If Robert loves you, he will remember you and return. If he does not, dragging yourself to him with a child will only multiply your shame." Pearl cried, "But Mama, what if I'm wrong either way?" Aline held her hand and said, "Then choose dignity, even in pain." Through tears, Pearl promised. She did not know that promise would shape every year that followed. Aline died before Pearl could prepare herself for the emptiness that followed. Grief had hardly settled into the room before gossip arrived ahead of condolence. Neighbors came with pity, sharpened by curiosity. Some lowered their voices to discuss Pearl's pregnancy as though she were deaf. Others pretended concern while asking the same cruel question in different forms. Where is the man responsible? Pearl buried her mother with swollen eyes and a numb heart, then returned to a room that felt too quiet and too public at once. She learned quickly that suffering rarely remains private in poor communities. Some relatives advised her to disappear before her stomach began to show fully. Others suggested she accept marriage from any man willing to cover the disgrace. One older woman muttered, "A woman alone with a pregnancy is meat in the open market." Pearl heard all of it, but something inside her stayed stubborn. She would not hand herself to loveless rescue just to silence people. She would grieve her mother, carry her child, and endure humiliation without trading dignity for convenience. At night, she cried into her wrapper, but by morning she stood straight again because there was nobody left to carry her. Pearl gave birth on a humid afternoon after a difficult labor that left her weak, trembling, and too exhausted to cry immediately. But the moment the nurse placed the baby in her arms, something in her rearranged. He was small, warm, and real, in a way fear had never prepared her for. She named him Philip. Looking into his tiny face, Pearl felt grief and love collide painfully inside her. "You are not my shame," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "You are proof that something in my life was once true." In that moment, motherhood became both burden and lifeline. The months that followed were harsh and unsentimental. Milk, rent, medicine, transport, food, everything cost more than she could manage. And still, the baby needed what babies need without apology. Pearl washed clothes for neighbors, sold little provisions on commission, cooked in other people's kitchens, and accepted jobs nobody else wanted. She learned how to smile through hunger so Philip would not inherit her panic. At night, when he slept against her chest, she let herself remember Robert, not with bitterness, but with a deep ache. Philip had his eyes already, and that truth made loving him both healing and painful. Far away, Robert slowly built himself out of humiliation. The man who once spoke carelessly about success became quieter, sharper, and emotionally disciplined. He learned to wait, to calculate, to survive insults without reacting. Small opportunities became bigger ones. He entered transport first, then property, then hotel investments through men who respected his patience. By the time serious money arrived, Robert had transformed so completely that even his laughter became rarer and more controlled. People abroad admired his composure. They called him focused. Nobody knew how much of that focus was simply pain trained into usefulness over many difficult years. Even as success grew, certain nights remained strangely hollow. On those nights, Robert would sit alone with a drink, staring at city lights and thinking of the girl who used to understand his silence without forcing words from him. He told himself he had searched in the ways he could. He told himself life had scattered everyone, but deeper down, was a guilt he never named properly. He had been too ashamed of struggling to look back honestly. It was easier to chase the next contract than reopen the emptiness of what he might have lost. Success rose. Peace never quite followed with it. Pearl became skilled at making hardship look decent. She kept Philip's clothes clean even when she had only one faded blouse for herself. She stretched food in ways that bordered on miracle and learned to answer intrusive questions with careful smiles. When children mocked Philip for not having a visible father, she knelt and adjusted his collar before saying, "Your life is not smaller because people talk." At home, she told him gentle stories about a man who once had enormous dreams. She never gave Robert's name. She only said, "Your father was not empty-hearted. Life just became hard somewhere." Philip grew into a thoughtful child far too early. He noticed when Pearl pretended she had already eaten. He learned not to ask for things twice. Sometimes he would divide his biscuits in half and say, "Mommy, I'm not very hungry." Pearl would turn away so he would not see her tears. Their struggle was rarely loud. Most days it was repetitive and exhausting: school levies, unpaid rent, cough syrup, kerosene, transport fare. Yet inside those ordinary hardships was a deep emotional bond. Pearl was not simply raising a son. She was raising the living reminder of a love she had buried but never stopped mourning. After years of unstable work, Pearl finally found a better job in a small neighborhood shop run by a kind widow who paid late sometimes, but paid fairly. For the first time in a long while, life softened slightly. Philip started school with proper books. Pearl bought him one pair of good sandals and cried afterward in private because small victories can hurt too when they come late. She began to imagine a steadier future, one modest enough not to offend fate. For a few months, she woke with something like hope instead of dread sitting on her chest every morning. Then the shop owner died suddenly, and everything collapsed at once. Her relatives fought over stock, money, and ownership before the burial even ended. The shop was locked, emptied, and swallowed by family greed. Pearl lost her income in a single afternoon. Standing outside the closed storefront, she felt the cruel familiarity of life snatching stability the moment she trusted it. Philip, older now and more observant, asked softly, "Mommy, are we starting again?" Pearl forced a smile and answered, "We never stop starting again." It was not bravery. It was simply the only truth she had left to offer him. 9 years after leaving, Robert returned to Nigeria carrying wealth, influence, and the polished distance of a man who had learnt never to appear uncertain in public. Business pages mentioned his name with admiration. Investors sought him. Industry men praised his discipline. He moved in convoys now, attended closed meetings, and spoke with the measured calm of someone used to being heard immediately. To outsiders, he looked like the full proof of ambition rewarded. Yet, when the aircraft wheels touched the runway at home, the feeling inside him was not triumph. It was something stranger, heavier, and far less comfortable. Familiar roads reopened buried parts of him. Certain junctions dragged old memories into the present before he could defend himself against them. He asked Kirk, his driver, to pass through neighborhoods tied to his younger years under the excuse of checking land prospects. Kirk said nothing, but noticed the way Robert stared out the window, as though searching for a face he had not earned the right to find. Robert did not tell anyone about Pearl. He barely admitted her to himself. But unfinished love has a stubborn way of surviving success, and home made that truth impossible to ignore any longer. It happened on an ordinary afternoon made unforgettable by one glance. Traffic locked around a crowded roadside market where hawkers slipped between vehicles with pure survival in their movements. Robert was half listening to a call when his eyes landed on a woman holding a boy's hand near the line of cars. At first, she was only part of the city's usual heartbreak. Then she lifted her face. Everything inside him stopped. "Kirk," he said sharply. "Stop the car." Kirk braked, startled. Robert stared harder, almost refusing what he saw. But memory does not mistake what the heart has carried for years. Pearl looked thinner, quieter, and worn in a way that made his chest tighten painfully. Her slippers were old. Her wrapper was faded. The boy beside her stood with solemn alertness, as though childhood had taught him caution before play. Robert stepped out before his security men could object. Pearl saw him immediately. Recognition flashed across her face like a wound reopening. But instead of calling his name or breaking down, she lowered her eyes. That silence shook him more than tears would have. "Pearl?" he said softly. She swallowed, gripped Philip's hand tighter, and answered in a trembling voice, "Welcome back, Robert." Robert did not ask many questions there on the roadside, because the answer to at least one question was already in front of him. Life had been cruel to Pearl. He insisted on helping immediately. Pearl resisted out of instinct more than strength. "We're fine," she said, though even she could hear how false it sounded. Philip was feverish, and her own face carried exhaustion too plainly. Robert's voice softened in a way it had not done in years. "Pearl, don't fight me on this. Just let me help for now." The old familiarity in his tone weakened her. She could not protect dignity against collapse forever. He arranged a private guest house instead of taking them somewhere public that would attract attention. New clothes, proper meals, medical tests, safe bedding, medicine, everything appeared quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. That should have brought relief. Yet Pearl felt only pressure tightening under her ribs. She was suddenly standing inside the life Robert had built, seeing with her own eyes what he had become. He was everything people once said he might be. And because of that, the truth became even more dangerous. If she spoke now, would he think she had appeared only because wealth had finally given her reason to return to him? The first few days at the guest house unsettled Robert in ways business never could. He told himself he was simply concerned for Pearl and the child, yet small details kept disturbing his calm. Philip was left-handed in the same absent-minded way Robert was. When he focused on something, his brows narrowed identically. Even his smile arrived sideways first, one cheek dimpling before the other. These were little things, easy to dismiss individually, but together they pressed uncomfortably against Robert's thoughts. He began watching Philip without meaning to, then catching himself and looking away as though afraid of what observation might imply. Philip, meanwhile, remained shy but observant. He thanked Robert politely, asked careful questions, and studied him with the grave curiosity children often reserve for adults who feel strangely familiar. During breakfast one morning, Philip asked, "Sir, do you always drink tea without sugar?" Robert looked up, surprised. "Yes." "How did you know?" The boy shrugged. "You make the same face mommy makes when something is too sweet." Robert laughed softly, then stopped laughing when Pearl looked down too quickly. Something invisible kept passing between the three of them, and with each day, the silence around it grew heavier rather than lighter. Robert tried gently to reopen the emotional closeness they once shared, but Pearl kept herself carefully measured. She thanked him. She answered what was necessary. She spoke with respect. Yet she never relaxed fully around him. There was always a hesitation in her voice, a guardedness in her eyes, as though one wrong sentence could break something fragile beyond repair. Robert found it painful because the Pearl he remembered had trusted him in a way that felt natural and complete. "Why do you speak to me like a stranger?" he asked one evening. Pearl forced a smile and replied, "Because time taught me caution." What Robert read as coldness was really fear, sharpened by years. Pearl knew the truth was no longer a distant possibility. It was sitting between them at every meal, walking beside Robert in Philip's face, breathing inside every silence. Yet, telling him now terrified her. If she spoke too soon, it could look calculated. If she waited too long, it could become betrayal. She lay awake nights, replaying her mother's hospital voice and imagining Robert's expression if he finally knew. Beneath all that fear was another wound she barely admitted to herself. Seeing him again had awakened love she had spent years forcing into silence. Melinda had walked beside Robert long enough to read the shifts he hid from everyone else. She knew when he was distracted, when he was irritated, when a deal excited him, and when something personal had slipped past his guard. So when he began canceling meetings, disappearing for long private hours, and answering questions with unusual impatience, she noticed immediately. Over dinner after a site inspection, she said lightly, "You've been elsewhere all week, Robert. Should I be jealous of a business rival or worried about an old ghost?" Robert looked at her steadily and answered, "Neither answer would help you much." Melinda was too polished to push openly, but curiosity and disappointment grew inside her. She had imagined that patience would eventually bring her closer to Robert than the title of business associate. Instead, some unseen history had entered the room and changed his emotional gravity entirely. When she finally met Pearl briefly, she understood more than Robert had said. Pearl carried poverty, exhaustion, and dignity with unsettling quiet. Philip stood close to her, watchful and reserved. Melinda sensed at once that this was not charity. This was something personal enough to threaten the future she had quietly placed her hopes inside for years now. Robert and Philip began spending time together in small, believable ways that made Pearl ache more than dramatic scenes would have. Robert helped him with simple arithmetic, corrected his handwriting gently, and listened with surprising patience when Philip asked endless questions about cars, cities, and airplanes. Sometimes they walked around the compound in the evening, while Pearl watched from the veranda, her chest full of gratitude and grief at once. Robert did not know he was learning his own son's patterns. Philip did not know he was trusting his own father. Yet something natural kept drawing them toward one another quietly. One afternoon, Philip asked Robert, "Did you always know how to become important?" Robert smiled faintly. "No, I only knew I didn't want to remain where I started." Philip thought about that and said, "Mommy says some people carry big futures inside them." Robert glanced toward the window, where Pearl stood, pretending not to listen. "Your mother says wise things," he answered. Pearl turned away quickly, swallowing emotion. Watching them together felt like being shown a life that should have been hers years ago. She wanted to rejoice in the tenderness, but every gentle moment also reminded her how much time silence had already stolen. One quiet evening after dinner, Philip sat beside Robert with a school book on his lap and asked, with childlike directness, "Do you have children?" Robert paused longer than the question should have required. "No," he said finally. Philip nodded, then asked the second question without warning. "Did you ever want one?" Something in Robert's expression changed. He looked at the boy properly before answering. "I think I would have liked that very much." Philip accepted the answer with a seriousness beyond his age. But Robert carried the question with him long after the conversation ended, as though it had opened a door inside him. That same night, Robert approached Pearl on the veranda where she sat, folding Philip's wash uniform. "Who is his father?" he asked softly, without anger, but without retreat. Pearl's fingers froze against the cloth. She kept her eyes lowered and said, "Life is complicated, Robert." He stepped closer, wounded frustration rising beneath his calm. "That is not an answer." Pearl forced herself to continue folding as though ordinary movement could protect her. "It is the only one I can give tonight." Robert stood there in silence, feeling the distance between them grow sharper. For the first time, he knew her silence was hiding something far deeper. That night, Pearl could not sleep. Memories came in fragments: her swollen feet during pregnancy, neighbors whispering behind half-closed doors, Philip burning with fever as a toddler, landlords threatening to throw their things outside, empty pots, unpaid levies, and the thousand humiliations that never make news because they happen quietly to ordinary women. She pressed both hands over her face and asked herself a question she had avoided for years. Had loyalty to her mother's final wish become cruelty to Philip and unfairness to Robert? She had called it dignity for so long. Lately, it was beginning to feel dangerously close to fear instead. Across town, Robert sat alone in his room with a drink untouched beside him. Success had taught him movement, not reflection, and now reflection arrived all at once. He thought about how easily he had allowed ambition to become excuse. He had told himself survival left no room for looking back. Later, he had told himself too much time had passed. But stripped of polished explanations, the truth felt ugly. He had not fought hard enough to find what mattered. Somewhere while building a future, he had abandoned the responsibility of memory. That realization sat in his chest, like guilt, finally finding its proper name and weight. The crisis came suddenly, the way real fear often does. In the middle of the night, Philip's fever spiked dangerously. Pearl woke to his skin burning under her palm, and panic took over before thought could arrange itself. Her hands shook as she tried to cool him, call for help, and hold back tears all at once. Robert, alerted by movements and raised voices, reached the hallway just as Pearl cried, "Philip, stay with me, baby." He took control instantly, carrying the boy while Kirk rushed the car around. Fear stripped everyone down to essentials. No past, no pride, only urgency remained. At the hospital, Pearl sat beside Philip's bed, trembling, while doctors walked and Robert handled forms, drugs, and instructions with quiet speed. When the room finally settled, she thought he had stepped outside. Exhaustion cracked her open. Bowing her head beside Philip, she whispered through tears, "I kept my promise, Mama. I didn't destroy his future. I carried it alone, just like you asked." Robert, standing just beyond the half-closed door, froze as every word struck him. He did not yet know the full truth, but he knew enough to feel his heartbeat turn heavy. Her whisper changed everything from that night onward. After that hospital night, Robert could no longer pretend his suspicions were imagination. He began piecing things together quietly, not like a man seeking scandal, but like someone terrified of the shape truth was taking. Philip was 8. Robert had left 9 years earlier. Pearl had said nothing all this time. Her whisper to Aline carried sacrifice, not bitterness. Even the boy's face now felt louder to him. He found himself staring at calendar dates, remembering the brief week he and Pearl had shared before he left, then looking away as if arithmetic itself had become painful. The possibility refused to stay hidden anymore. He also began asking careful questions in places where memory still lived. An old neighbor mentioned Pearl's mother dying around the time Pearl got into trouble. A former chemist remembered seeing Pearl heavily pregnant and alone. Nobody gave him a complete story, but every fragment pushed against his chest like accusation. Robert returned home one afternoon and sat silently in the car after Kirk parked. Finally, Kirk asked, "Sir, are you all right?" Robert stared ahead and answered, "No. I think I may have come home to discover that my success was built beside somebody else's ruin." Saying it aloud made the guilt feel even worse. Pearl knew she could not keep the truth buried much longer. Robert's eyes had changed. He was no longer simply helping her out of old loyalty. He was hurting, thinking, connecting, what should have remained hidden forever. One afternoon, while Philip rested after school, Pearl finally told him part of the story. She spoke about Aline's illness, the hospital corridors, the bills, the fear, and the promise made at a dying woman's bedside. Robert sat without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands clasped too hard. Pearl's voice trembled only once, when she said, "I was trying to obey love, even if it looked like silence." She told him she had feared dragging him into fatherhood while he was still struggling to stand abroad. Later, when word reached her that he had become wealthy, the truth felt even harder to tell. "How was I supposed to appear then?" she asked, eyes wet. "Like a woman who waited until you became rich before remembering your name?" Robert shut his eyes briefly, devastated not by doubt, but by understanding. Pearl had not hidden Philip out of spite. She had hidden him inside pride, fear, and sacrifice. And while he was learning to conquer the world, she had been protecting his rise from a distance that destroyed her. The confrontation that followed was quieter than anger and far more painful. Robert stood by the window for a long time before finally turning toward Pearl. His eyes were wet, his composure broken in a way she had never seen. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. And the question carried years inside it, missed birthdays, lonely nights, small humiliations, and the life he might have lived differently. Pearl's hands twisted in her wrapper, as though she could still physically hold the past together. "I told you," she whispered. "I was afraid of what telling you would cost you. Then I feared what silence had already cost us." Robert shook his head slowly, wounded in a place pride could not protect. "You thought so little of my heart?" he asked, voice cracking. Pearl's own tears fell then. "No," she said with the kind of honesty that hurts because it is pure. "I thought too much of your future." The words shattered whatever distance remained between them. Robert sat down heavily, covering his face. In that moment, the hidden child was no longer the deepest tragedy. The real wound was that love had survived between them all these years only by turning itself into sacrifice, silence, and misunderstanding, until it almost destroyed everybody involved. Even though his heart had already accepted the truth, Robert arranged for formal confirmation with quiet respect. He did not want rumor, noise, or the kind of drama that turns private pain into spectacle. Pearl agreed because at this point certainty felt kinder than endless tension. Still, the waiting period was brutal. Robert found himself studying Philip more carefully than ever, grieved by every familiar trait he had once overlooked. Pearl, on the other hand, feared not the result, but what certainty would unleash afterward. Once truth had a document, nothing could ever return to the old fragile balance that silence had maintained for years. When the result came back confirming Philip was his son, the room did not explode into celebration. It grew quieter. Robert sat holding the paper as though it weighed far more than a few lines of medical language. He was not only reading proof of fatherhood, he was reading evidence of absence, of lost time, of a little boy who had learned caution before he learned security. Pearl watched him with a guarded face and a breaking heart. After a long silence, Robert whispered, "He was mine all this time." Pearl answered softly, "He was always yours. I just didn't know how to return him to you." Robert did not try to rush into the word father as though biology alone entitled him to it. That restraint mattered. Philip already liked him, but liking a man and understanding what he means to your life are not the same thing. Robert began with presence, school drop-offs, homework, short conversations, careful consistency. He noticed everything now. The way Philip curled one foot under himself while reading, the way he frowned before smiling, the way he watched adults before trusting them. Sometimes Robert stood quietly at Philip's doorway after the boy fell asleep, feeling joy and grief so tightly mixed he could barely separate one from the other. One evening, Philip asked, "Why do you look at me sometimes like you want to say something?" Robert swallowed. "Because some important things take time to say properly," he replied. The boy nodded as though he understood more than he should. For Pearl, these early moments were both comforting and excruciating. Robert was stepping toward fatherhood with care, but every gentle attempt reminded her of the years she had carried alone. She would catch him laughing softly with Philip and feel warmth rise, only for sorrow to follow close behind. Love was returning, but it was returning through grief first, not ease. Melinda finally asked the question her pride had delayed for too long. They were in Robert's office after a meeting when she closed the door and said, "Who is she, really?" Robert did not insult her with lies. He told her only what was necessary, that Pearl was someone from his past and that his life had changed in ways he could no longer ignore. Melinda stood very still, absorbing the answer and the parts left unsaid. "So all this time," she said quietly, "I was waiting beside a man whose heart was already occupied by a wound." Robert did not deny it. That honesty hurt her more. Melinda withdrew from her romantic hopes with dignity, but the world outside was less graceful. Society noticed Robert's growing attachment to a poor woman and a little boy who seemed to appear from nowhere. Whispers began in polished rooms and traveled fast. Pearl felt each rumor like a fresh layer of humiliation. She had survived poverty. Now she had to survive being discussed by wealthy strangers who treated lives like gossip material. Robert tried to shield her without making her feel managed. "You are not a scandal," he told her firmly. Pearl looked at him and answered, "Maybe not, but I am tired of being interpreted." The truth reached Philip in a quiet room with no dramatic audience, exactly as it should. Pearl sat beside him, hands trembling in her lap, while Robert remained close enough to show presence but not pressure. Pearl explained first, slowly and gently, that some truths adults hide out of fear and pain, not because children are unloved. Philip listened without interrupting, which somehow made the moment sadder. When Robert finally said, "Philip, I am your father," the boy's face changed, not with rage, but with confusion, so deep it looked like hurt, trying to understand itself. He lowered his eyes and went silent. After a long pause, Philip asked the simplest and hardest question. "If you were my father, why were you never there?" Pearl closed her eyes briefly. Robert answered before she could rescue him from the pain of it. "Because I did not know, and because I failed to find what I should have searched for harder," he said. Philip looked between them both. Pearl explained protection. Robert explained absence, struggle, and ignorance. None of it erased the wound immediately. Yet, children often recognize sincerity, even when they cannot process it fully. Philip did not forgive that day, but he did not turn away completely either. Robert's instinct was to fix things: better housing, better school, better structure, better everything. It was not pride driving him so much as guilt with resources. But Pearl resisted the speed of repair. She was grateful, deeply so, yet something inside her recoiled from becoming a woman absorbed into his polished world as though money could rewrite history. "I do not want to be rescued like a project," she told him one afternoon. Robert took the words quietly, though they stung. He was learning that provision, which had become easy for him, was not the same as emotional restoration. One required wealth, the other required humility. Their class difference, once only background, now stood directly between them. Robert's homes, meetings, and social circles belonged to a life Pearl had never asked for and did not trust easily. She had spent too long surviving to enter comfort without suspicion. You can give Philip stability, she said, but don't try to erase where I have been. I survived it. That matters. Robert nodded slowly. Then teach me how to stand in your life without swallowing it. The honesty of that answer softened her, though not completely. Love was possible again, but only if it came without ownership, without pity, and without rewriting her pain as inconvenience. Even now, after truth had surfaced and Philip had begun adjusting, Pearl still considered living quietly. It was an old instinct, the same one that had guided so many lonely choices before. Disappear before your presence becomes burden. She feared becoming a permanent reminder of Robert's guilt inside his immaculate world. She feared being judged by people who smiled with polished cruelty. She feared the subtle humiliation of always being the woman who came from hardship into luxury under a complicated story. So one evening, she began folding clothes with that dangerous calm women sometimes wear when they are preparing to vanish without noise again. But Philip saw more than adults often realize. He stood in the doorway and said, "Mommy, are you trying to leave because of me or because of him?" Pearl froze. The question was too clear to escape. When Robert joined them moments later, Philip looked at both of them and added, "I don't want more secrets. I don't want anybody disappearing to protect me without asking me." His voice shook, but he did not stop. "I want truth. I want who stays to stay." That simple plea cut through years of sacrifice and pride. For the first time, both Pearl and Robert understood that silence was no longer noble. It was harm. The ending did not arrive with a grand wedding, public declaration, or sudden perfection. It arrived more quietly, in choices repeated with sincerity. Robert stopped trying to claim and began asking instead. He asked Pearl what she needed, not what he wanted to provide. He asked Philip how he preferred their new closeness to grow. He showed up consistently without turning presence into performance. One evening, seated with them on a modest veranda rather than in one of his grand living rooms, Robert said softly, "I cannot recover the years I lost, but if you let me, I will spend the rest of my life earning what should have mattered sooner." Pearl did not pretend the past no longer hurt. Some wounds survive even inside hope, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that pain did not have to be the final shape of her story. Philip, still adjusting, began slowly learning what reliable presence felt like. Not luxury, not spectacle, just presence. Robert entered fatherhood carefully, and love returned not as the wild certainty of youth, but as something humbler and stronger. Their story closed on emotional restoration, not perfection. What Robert earned was not ownership over the life he had missed, but belonging inside it at last. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.